All right, today on the show we have Todd Katler, founder and CEO of Anyone Home. Todd has a great depth of experience, more than 25-year veteran of multifamily on both the management and operational side of the business, but also implementing innovation into multifamily. His goal and vision for elevating rental housing experience for both the residents and existing residents, both from perspective and the experience on-site professionals have on-site, is really something that we're really tuned into. He has successfully graduated Anyone Home from startup to more than 300 employees and doing more than 1 million contacts per month. We're here to talk to you today, Todd, about what's next for leasing and multifamily. Todd, welcome in.
Thank you for having me. It's glad to be here.
Yeah, so listen, I just want to talk to you a little bit about what's different now and what's that role of leasing. Where are we going with all of this?
It's interesting. Multifamily historically is very, very slow to change because there's really not a lot of existential risk. For the most part, if you're an operator, you either make a lot of money or a little bit less than a lot of money, but you're not going to not make any money. I think with the onset of the pandemic, what we saw is changes that were already happening by early adopters. That whole early adopter curve just sort of moving to the left a bit, where people who were risk adverse are saying, "Geez, we can do something or nothing. Let's do something." But we're seeing a lot of companies that otherwise wouldn't have changed a lot, changing quite a bit now.
Yeah, and so the question on that, let's go into the fears. Let's go back before the forced innovation with forced change.
Sure.
And, you mentioned something very interesting in that success sometimes can be the biggest issue for, and we saw that with the hotels and auto industry. The future of even an auto dealer, I'm looking at industries like that, seeing massive change and the intermediaries in that customer experience. And so what do you think the fears are, I think, in bringing on something that maybe it's not just the early adopters getting involved, but really it's everybody should, just because of the customer experience?
I mean, self-guided tours is probably the easiest one to show as an example of that. So we started Anyone Home to serve institutionally owned single-family operators, people that own 10,000 plus units of single family. They adopted self-guided tours in seconds because they had to survive. It was the only way they were going to be able to operate with a margin even remotely similar to multifamily. So if you're trying to attract that same institutional capital, you don't have much of a choice. We launched self-guided tours for multifamily from a technology perspective a year and a half ago. It took almost a full year just to get the first properties to finally commit and say, okay, let's start testing this. I've been in the industry a long time. Never have I had so many discussions about what happens if Antarctica melts as I have with self-guided tours, where, well, what if someone leaves the door open, or what if someone steals a pillow off the couch? And, then I guess you're going to lose a pillow off the couch.
Right.
So, I mean, they're like $6 at Home Goods. So, so there was just so much of, this is the way we do it. It doesn't fit in this box. So you saw a lot of this, geez, can we have someone on our property without being escorted, which, people kind of forget. That's multifamily 101. You don't have control over who's on your property. Even if you have controlled access, people are coming and going all the time. It's not like you have a retina scan. And then we also saw a lot of fear of what happens when it's not our agent doing this highly cultivated tour and asking these questions and answering these questions. And what we saw is that for the people that gravitated towards self-guided tours, they actually converted to leads much higher because they got to spend more time. They didn't have someone waiting on them.
Right, and that more time to start visualizing their own experience moving in, and a lot of times the product. You're talking about leasing agent and the turnover, having a new leasing agent talking about the product there, from the human aspect. I mean, we make a lot of errors as humans.
Sure.
Right. And technology sometimes makes less. I don't know if you're seeing any benefits to having a more consistent brand experience than having, constantly retraining and training people and hoping that not only going to keep you in a minimized risk standpoint from even fair housing and all these other elements, but also to really talking about the community in the right way.
Yeah, I think the consistency is a big deal. As you know, we operate a 24/7 contact center as well. Actually, about almost 400 employees in there now, and I always say, your best leasing agents are always better than our contact center because they live there or they live in the neighborhood. They know the property inside and out. They're always going to be better. But our average is always better than our customers' average because of that consistency, because you only have to train someone to do something one way. So I think what you just talked about is like, how do you be consistent on every encounter to make it predictable? Is certainly something that really presents itself in that you can start to say, like, okay, we're going to have 1,000 inquiries this month. They're going to go about like this. You're going to have some really good ones. You're going to have some really bad ones, but they're going to go about like this. And it allows you to forecast in a much more efficient way and advertise in a much more efficient way because you understand how your leads are going to convert.
Yeah, and I always wonder about that consumer because, and even now with the acceleration of the customers still needing a place, and people were forced to not do tours because of the social distancing and things like that. And the customer has now come to expect even a virtual tour, self-guided tour, something of this sort, right? And I always just think about, how much sales is really involved in the process, in that do customers starting to sort of decide already, like, I know this is a location, I've seen this property, I've been driving by it for a long time, I've heard some people that have already lived there, like, are people coming in a little bit more educated, and do we even need to close as much in terms of being more consistent on things?
I think across the board, consumers are more educated than they ever were. And that changes sales in every environment, right? Not just leasing apartments, but B2B sales and whatnot. People are more educated. That being said, I like to kind of compare to Zappos all the time, who, in most of our opinions, is probably one of the best service companies in the world. And one of the reasons why Zappos is so successful is because they're agnostic in how you get to interact with them. And that's really important. So each of us, you line 10 of us up, some of us are going to say, no, I don't want to talk to a human. I want self-guided tour. I want an online app. I want an online lease. And frankly, if there was something I could do to get my key or code that would move in and never speak to a human, that would be great. And you would have someone on the other end of the spectrum say, actually, this is where I'm going to live. This is home. And home to me is about who I'm surrounded by. And I want to know, hey, if I'm having a bad day, are there a couple smiling faces in the leasing office that are going to sit and chit chat with me for a minute? I'm a dog lover. Are there other dog lovers here? Things that are not necessarily about, where's the fridge and is there a walk-in closet, right? Stuff that's more expository. But what is it going to be like to live there? And that's a little less binary. So I think kind of taking the cue from Zappos, rather than try and say, okay, well, leasing is going to be this way, or we're going to use AI for this, is to say, there's a certain number of leases we want to transact. We want people to be happy because if we minimize turnover, it really, really pays off in the long run for all of our financials. So how are we going to give people choice and let them communicate in their own currency and the way they want to, so that they can say, hey, I'm all automated, but I just hit a stumbling block. I kind of want to talk to a human now, and allow them to transition however they want to talk to that human in real time.
That's a good point. You have emotional buyers and logical buyers, and they make decisions off of different information, and those are some really powerful points. And it's interesting. How do we have the tech stack, I guess, to fully do something like that? Can you talk to us a little bit, maybe even more about what you're doing with your platform on how to solve some of those, even in the forms of automating the tasks, so that maybe when someone gets to that stop point, then you have really a concierge, maybe the role of leasing changes. Talk to me a little bit about what you guys are working on.
Yeah, it's funny you use concierge. We actually launched a product last year called Concierge that exact purpose is. So we look at it, and I think if this interests you, if you're viewing this, you should look at everyone out there and decide who's best for you. But we look at it as there's a combination of automation and human interaction that work together to do that. So, kind of looking at the different channels, obviously you need to be able to have, SMS and web chat and phone and email / kind of web forms. But you also need to be able to have consistency in how those are responded to. So for instance, when we look at how many inbound SMS are not responded to by the customers, or people who like to try and do web chat, but have the properties responding to it, where those web chats sit there for 20 minutes unresponded. So it's not just having the technology, it's having a catcher's mitt. And when you set that expectation, like, hey, if I SMS you, my expectation is I'm going to get a pretty quick return. If I say I'm ready to web chat, my expectation is 30 seconds, maybe 45 seconds. If it's 10 minutes, you just completely let down that prospect. And you actually set the stage that if I don't care enough about you to respond now, how much am I going to care about you once you're living here, when you have a service request that you need? So setting the stage up front that your interaction is important to me. So therefore, 24/7, whether you call, email, web chat, SMS, do none of those because you want to book a tour using a widget or a chatbot, or a self-guided tour using those same interactions, and then having automated follow-up that complements the physical follow-up. And those, I actually just kind of described our company in a nutshell. But great. It's all those things.
That's great. And, Apple figured that out early with the bubbles. If you're on iPhone, that you send someone a text, you say, okay, they're on it. They're gathering the response, and it puts that customer at ease. Like, hey, that expectation of responses is different in really that these are like little cultures or atmospheres, depending on how they engage. What are you seeing in terms of, you're spending a lot of time with a lot of executives, innovation, and people that are onboarding a process like this when you're getting a new client, I imagine. What's changing in the role of who identifies all of these things, and how do they bring them actually into an organization? What's that process look like?
Well, prior to COVID, it was very similar to how it's always been, which is, depending on the size of the company, it's either something led by operations or something led by either marketing or IT. It depends on the structure of that company. Now, post or with COVID, the attention on operations is different than it was 6 months ago. So you're seeing a lot more C-level people get far more involved than they used to, because there's some quick investment that needs to be made, or some stuff regarding the real estate, particularly with self-guided tours, that might make people uncomfortable. So we're seeing a lot more with that. But I think the most interesting part of it is the shape of the industry. There's been a lot of companies dabbling with what I would call inside sales. And we've been powering that for some customers for years now. And now we're starting to see more and more customers understand that, geez, you could take some folks, centralize them, or in COVID, decentralize them, but nevertheless make them make them effective over a larger number of properties. And really change the way you think about how you lease and service your residents and your prospective residents that way. In fact, 10 years ago when I was at BRE, I was trying to do this, and there just wasn't any software to do it. Everything was very property centric. So it kind of goes back to accounting. You have a management company, you have a property, and then you have people associated with the property. So when you have density, like all real estate has, you keep duplicating prospects, and you're trying to get them to lease over here, but they already leased over there at one of your sister communities. So you kind of sound like an idiot. So having a prospect-centric architecture was key to that. And it was something that was really near and dear to us when we started the company. It really has enabled people to say, hey, I can work all of Southern California, or I can work all of Dallas regardless of how many properties there are.
Yeah, and let's dive into really how you ventured out. What inspired you to start that company? Obviously, you mentioned a little bit about BRE, and times have changed since then. This prospect-centered, network or architecture, whatever that might be. How do we really get to that?
So it was a really interesting opportunity for me to go on the property side, and probably not the best fit for a serial entrepreneur to go work for a public REIT. But it was
research and research.
Yeah, no,
R&D.
Well, it's exactly what it was, because over half of what we built at Anyone Home came out of that experience. So when you're on the vendor side, the supplier side, you tend to see what's going on and say, oh, here's an area of inefficiency that I can build product around, and that's really how you look at it, right? Or here's something I can solve a problem. Once you're neck deep in it, and I would really, for anyone who's only been on the vendor side or supplier side, what you learn by going to the property side and understanding how challenging the job is that a leasing agent has, just how chaotic it is. Right. It's very humbling. Because when you're only on the vendor side, you go, oh, properties never do this, or they never answer their calls, or they never respond to leads, and then you go spend a day in their shoes and go, I don't know how to do this. Like, this is really hard. And so it really inspired a lot of innovation for us, and we continue to try and advocate for that baseline team, because that's really what's going to move the needle the most. I was just watching people spend 15 minutes deciding how they can spend 5.
Right.
I'd watch it all the time. I spent about 1 day a week on site, and I'd be like, okay, so what's timing look like? It's 1:50. Well, I have another appointment at 2. Great. What are we gonna do now? I got to figure out maybe some follow-ups to do. I'm like, okay, how are we gonna go do that? And I would watch the system going, oh my God, like, you should be able to do what everyone does in B2B sales, which is load up a dashboard, and it has prioritized for you what the next 3 things you should do is. If you can get to all 3, great. If you can only get to 1, okay. But I would watch them spend 10 minutes and actually not do anything, because it took them 10 minutes to figure out what to do.
Right.
And that's, so I wanted to build something around that. Then I realized, oh, well, they're never going to get to everything. So how do we automate that, what they aren't going to get to? So at least there's some air cover. So it was really interesting to watch that. And then how much stuff do we put down on site that shouldn't be on site? It should be centralized. So that was, we did a lot with that. I looked at our long tail leads. I remember saying, okay, 1/3 of our leads are looking more than 30 days out. So we're calling them and saying, hey, do you want to come into tour? Oh, can I see the unit I'm going to rent? No. Well, do you know how much the unit's going to be? No. Like, why are we telling them to come in a tour? So what we did is we took 2 people off site, put them in the corporate office, and said, I want you to nurture these leads. And our conversion rate on those leads doubled instantly. Because we would say, hey, it looks like, Patrick, you want to move October 1st. I'm going to call you around September 10th. I'm going to have you come in, and then we'll be able to show you the unit you can live in, or at least something very similar to it. But if that's what you like, we can lock it up for you.
Meanwhile, your VP or regional is saying, hey, we got to rent today, so get him in here and do whatever you can. Right,
but they're not renting from you today. Like, if you could rent to 100% of people, the job would be easy. All right.
Right.
So,
Aon did a study a while back about, you go back to back in the day, they had the home shows, or even like the bridal expos and home improvement shows. And if you remember, you'd go to these shows and they'd have these like cards you'd fill out, and they'd give away things, and then somebody would call them back. Well, they researched the company that sort of administers all of those, where all those the data warehouse that all those cards go to. And in the first, most sales are done like in the first 90 days, like they'll follow up, and then after 90 days, they're not a buyer.
Right.
And someone comes in at some point, fills out a card for shutters or something, in their new home. And they're not really wanting to buy it now, but the sales team sort of aborts after that 60-day, 90-day. And they said something like, I think 50% of them will buy something within the next 18 months, or it was a longer period of time than most would focus on following up. But they had a system where every 6 months they would just send an email like, hey, you were looking for shutters, did you buy any? And that simple email, just a check-in, you know, converted substantially more just by, you know, having a process to say, hey, look, we're not going to give up on the lead because they didn't, you know, rent now as we want them to, because we have some financing event going and we need to, you know, rush the process. But they had a system, an automation that said, look, this is somebody that showed interest at some point in time. And the numbers, the data just doesn't lie, you know, on that process. So
we believe in that. We believe in that very deeply. We believe that you should deliver the right message to the right person at the right time. And one of the biggest mistakes I see our customers make, or in other systems that they might use, is, okay, if a lead was created today, we're going to follow up every 3 days, and we're going to follow up 5 times. And it's a kind of a fire and forget like way of going about it, where the reality is it should be, Mr. or Mrs. Prospect, when are you planning on moving? And the cadence of your sales process should be dictated on the delta between today and when you're planning on moving, and how far you are in the sales process. So we built our system around that, so that the engagement for each prospect is cultivated, and rather than kind of fire and forget.
Yeah, it's interesting. You mentioned earlier in the show about concierge. That was something I hadn't heard about. Is this where, can you talk to us a little bit about what you see the future of a leasing agent? Let's say there's somebody leading their teams. What does the future look like for them, and how can they make an impact?
So concierge for us was really a chatbot. We were looking at the user experience and saying there was a chat icon here and a phone number here and an email here and a self-scheduled tour here and a self-guided tour here, and it was like widget overload. And there could be duplicative stuff. So we wanted to combine every way prospects and residents should communicate into one interface. But you know, when you go past that, when you talk about the role of the leasing agent, not the role of the technology, I think what we're going to see is this centralization and our industry's ability to get comfortable with people being off site is going to allow for a bifurcation in skills. You know, if you talk to any great regional manager, they'll tell you that, you know, a lot of the great recruiting they've done is at the shopping mall, right? You know, where they met someone at a clothing store who just had that one of those great personalities, and you were able to recruit them, or you met someone at a Starbucks and they're like, hey, you don't have to wake up at 5 a.m. anymore. Come work here. Right. You know, they just have one of those things that you can't teach someone. But that's because our industry has always looked at sales as a 4-letter word. So once you bifurcate, like, hey, these are people that are going to be responsible for selling, and these are people that are going to be responsible for service. Why we have been able to do that in the past is, unless you're over 400 or 500 units, you just don't have enough staffing to bifurcate responsibility and provide coverage. So now, once you centralize a lot of this, now you can, because all your appointments will be all your tours will be by appointment or self-guided. And maybe you get a walk-in, there'll be somebody there that can help, but that'll be the minority of what you do. So much of what we do in multifamily is just about coverage.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting, and in some cases, maintenance is the first point of contact, because the whole process has been, you know, automated, and that's the first contact that they're seeing in many cases. It's very interesting. So let's talk about, I guess, where we go from here. I mean, I think there's we're coming out of this pandemic, this forced way to think differently, and we've added new ways to even work and collaborate with teams. You were getting involved with, you guys have a lot of units under your ecosystem, and so now I imagine things are even accelerating. But where do we go from here?
So first is, I think we're going to see a bit of a metamorphosis in how executives look at success. So if you historically look at multifamily, and you look at any C-level person, when they're looking at a box score or whatever management report they're using, it's how many leases did we do last week, and how many tours did we do last week, and yada, yada, yada. and it's all a derivative of a financial metric. And the comparison I like to draw is if you were talking about how do I go win a football game, you could say, well, we got to go score 4 touchdowns. Sure, right? That would be great. But what a winning football team really does is do really well at 3rd and 6th, right? So it's those core competencies that you have that allow you to consistently move the ball down the field, get first down conversions, and a touchdown or a field goal is the natural evolution of that consistent way to move the ball. So if all you're doing is measuring points on the board, you're actually measuring past tense. If you're measuring or you're managing activities and the right activities, you're actually putting yourself in a position to produce success. So slowly I'm seeing more C-level executives start to look at, okay, what percentage of our leads are managed? What percentage of our tours have dispositions that allow me to say, how did this go? How are we doing quality analysis on our inbound contacts and evaluating them for what the likely outcome or the desired outcome that we would like to have? What percentage of our tasks are being completed and when? So these are all metrics that on your Yardi or OneSite or MRI or whatever report would never show up because they're CRM metrics. So it's a true adoption of CRM as not that software that tells me where I should advertise, but that software that helps me manage my teams. Forever, we would see you would deploy CRM to the properties. Sometimes even the regional managers wouldn't want access. Now it's you got to have, if you can have the CEO have access, that's best. If it's such a big company and they just don't look at that stuff, fine. But the highest person in operations need to. That's going to be the biggest driving change of everything else, because once you start looking at all those levers as a C-level person, you start to adopt, oh, I see. When I move this dial, boy, our NOI really changes. And by the way, when this drops, boy, do we have to advertise a whole lot more to make up for poor sales skills. So it really gives you a deep understanding of how to predict rather than respond. It's sort of like measuring exposure versus measuring vacancy. Vacancy is a past tense measurement. Exposure is telling you about that bus coming down the street that may run you over.
That's right. That's right. And you're talking about even the leading indicators. Good asset managers are now having some of that data at the same time the property managers have it, and so we have to be even faster to move those levers, as you say. I love the sports analogies. They matter so much because the athletes aren't looking at the scoreboard during the play, right? They're looking at the scoreboard maybe for a replay of a great play they made or something like that, but it already happened, right? So if you're doing all those great things, you're moving those levers, then that 4 touchdowns is an outcome of the things that you do versus I love that. And I know when we think about it, sports gives us that perspective of they get it, investing in the process that allows you to put better people in the winning positions because everything's at stake. The beer contract to the signage, and now if you had TV contracts, you'd still be showing something. But all of that matters to the whole customer. You've got investors as customers, you have the employees as customers, you have the real customers, the ones that make all this happen, the residents. And it sounds like you're giving people their time back, but also the ability to sort of look forward in an industry that's always looked back. Yeah.
And be able to increase the professionalism of our industry. One thing that our industry has an abundance of is people who are kind of salt of the earth and good-hearted. I think in the nature that we provide housing, I think we tend to gravitate towards some of the best people. And I just think about all the people I've met, I'm sure as you have over these decades, and they're lifelong friends, and I'm always impressed by the quality of the humans. So I think taking and adding, hey, you know, this is the way a professional B2B organization would operate. You can actually do that here, and do it more efficiently. And you mentioned fear a couple times. Is staffing going to change on site? Yeah. Now, when I see people get up and say, there's not going to be a need for leasing agents, let's go back to Zappos. When you're really having an issue and you're upset, you're going to do web chat or phone, both of which involve a human. Yeah, some of the web chat may be AI at first, but
Right.
when your forehead there's crinkly because you're pissed, you're gonna talk to a human
Yeah, you
who's
don't
gonna
even.
try and
Yeah,
help you. Yeah, is the staffing level going to be the same as it is today? Probably not. But every time I hear people say, "Oh, you don't need leasing agents anymore," I'm like, this is a people business. Those people may change, they may evolve, there may be fewer, but that's not going away.
yeah, and there's so much. There's been a lot of study around even AI, and even going back to conversations outside our industry about how AI is eating jobs and all these things. And you look around at. We were watching an old Office Space. I think it was the movie, and you look at one of those scenes, and you look at like all the things on that little cubicle that's no longer there. It's essentially been eaten by technology, and it allowed them to essentially do more important things than entering
Sure.
data and printing data and things like that. But as time goes on, you look at people are behind the cloud, technology. You look at even Uber; they're using the technology, but still you still have a driver doing the things. And so it's interesting when I think of the role of the leasing agent. Do you see somebody that has different skill sets? Like, hey, listen, there's no doubt about that the world's changing, and the customer expectations are changing, and the platforms that you use will evolve. Maybe is it, if you're a leasing agent today, you're training them like, let's get involved, let's figure out how do you engage in messaging people in written form, in sort of the Zappos approach. By the time they get to a conversation, they've been through those steps. Like, what are you telling people to tell their teams about? How do you sort of prepare people for the future? Is it they just need to know how to be platform, not be curious about new tools, how to move swiftly through them, how to be patient, how to communicate in different ways?
Well, I think it starts with, are you hiring for the right skill set, right? So if you start to think about it as, I'm going to have outside sales, which is how we would look at the leasing agent role today, inside sales, customer service roles, right? And I'm going to leave service out of it, and then really go into the assistant manager role, right? So there's really 4 distinct skill sets there. So working backwards, the assistant manager role is more of an admin role, right? It's a lot about collecting rent and process, right? When you get into customer service, it's really just about being friendly and competent and organized. Inside sales and outside sales are somewhat similar from a skill set, except that outside salesperson's the gregarious, couldn't be in front of a computer all day, they'd go crazy, needs to have that human contact, versus inside sales might be have a good phone voice and whatnot, but actually is comfortable with that little bit of anonymity that the computer screen creates. So if you're hiring for those 4 distinct core competencies, what we've done here, historically, is we hire someone to be leasing because that's the baseline role, and then promote them into assistant manager if they were really good. So we took someone who actually probably had decent sales skills and made them a junior bookkeeper, and then wonder why we have high turnover. So, if you have someone who's apt to be a people engager, let them do that. The problem is you needed better leverage of your folks in order to give someone a career path. So I think once we start with hiring for those core skill sets, this is going to present itself easier. When you look at who we're hiring today, for the most part, the people looking for the jobs that we're offering, if you grew up in the last 15 years, you're somewhat adept to technology anyways. You're used to working on a mobile device and whatnot. Even if you're not, it's upon all of us to make sure we're producing software that's fairly intuitive and not super hard to use. And then from there, we see where it goes. I saw, like for instance, Avalon Bay, I don't even know how long ago, took all of their assistant managers and centralized it, I think, in Virginia Beach. So they took that role and made it far more efficient. So there's going to be a lot of centralization. So it's not necessarily jobs are going to go away, it's where they are that are going to change.
Very interesting, very interesting. Are you tracking other interesting either technologies or trends outside the industry?
We try to keep a really good look on what consumer engagement looks like as a whole, and what applies to our industry and what doesn't. The thing to remember about our industry is the transaction volume is very low. So when you look at a 250 unit building, let's say it's 6% exposed, that's what, 15 leases a month. It's not going to change. There's just not a lot of transactions. That's one every other day, and let's face it, 2 or 3 of those happen on Saturday. So the transaction volume is really, really low. So it's hard sometimes to adopt things from other industries where there is some comparisons, like the auto industry, because you don't go buy a new car every month. It's something you buy infrequently and is an expensive purchase. So auto translates well in some ways, and it's a personal acquisition for most people, just like where you live.
Yeah, no, that's a great analogy, I guess, or explanation there, because you still have leases that come due, and if the dealer's on it, right, then they'll know, like, hey, this person's going to be in the market at this point in time. But you're right, the dollar amounts in those transactions are significant when you calculate like all the rents and stuff, but certainly not like at an In-N-Out or something where they're just thousands of customers coming in. And
or even Amazon, like, where am I going to order this from this week? Or do I like going to the same supermarket to buy detergent, or do I like going to Costco, or is Costco a pain in the butt right now because of all this stuff? So you're not going to have this like high transaction volume where you look at a typical brand marketer that can say, oh, okay, like, I'm Coca-Cola and I'm going to do this. So when you're thirsty, you think of my like beautiful white polar bears. That doesn't translate as well in our industry, which is, every time I think about renting an apartment, I'm going to think about XYZ company. And I think there's some good examples of that, like, where I live in Orange County, kind of hard to miss the Irvine Company. Back in the day, if you lived in Atlanta, kind of hard to miss Post. Right. So, or where you are in Phoenix, it was hard to miss a Mark Taylor sign, right? In a lot of ways. So there's been good examples of brand identity within a market. I think nationally, it's a little harder to achieve that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Those are some great points. Well, listen, this has been an amazing conversation. We're coming up towards the end of our time together. Are there any final thoughts you want to leave our viewers with?
I think be bold. Out of this adversity comes a lot of opportunity. And we're seeing customers really, really just sort of, where before it's, we can't implement that because of this Microsoft Word document that we're holding. You can choose to put the Microsoft Word document down and say, what has worked for us before may not be the best way to work in the future. And it'll make everyone uncomfortable because people like that safety blanket. But that's okay. I would say learn to be comfortable being uncomfortable. And it's amazing how much you'll be able to achieve. Some of the stuff that we're seeing some of our bolder customers do is just really exciting to watch.
That's great. That's great. We're in a time of innovation and change, and that's a time for leadership. Obviously, our industry is growing. We're still building. There's a demand for more units and more solutions and leaders. And when we think about things that have happened in the past, you look at the automobile, You look at, when the automobile came along, it was defined as a horseless carriage, right? Something
Right.
had to define it as something old to really talk
Right.
about even something new. Like that's just the way we did it. Cordless phones, same thing. Like why would you ever have a phone that didn't have a cord? So we have to talk about it as a cordless phone. Even in the movie industry, it was motion pictures. It's like this picture actually moves, and so. In a lot of ways, we're at a time where people can really be part of where things are going, step up and lead. We want to bring on guests like you, Todd, because not only are you excited about things, but you're getting it done, helping people solve big problems in multifamily. And you've been through, like we talked about earlier, the R&D of multifamily and taking some of those things and getting excited about really truly helping people. And when you can help people, it's really remarkable how they will, at the end of the day, want to work with you. And so thank you for all your service for multifamily and all the things that you guys are working on.
Likewise, and thank you so much for having me. It was great to be part of this.
Yeah, very good. Well, we'll see you on the next show then.
Thank you. We'll love to be here.